And welcome to Hour 2 of the Richard Syrett Show. I stand with BC Conservative MLA Dallas Brody. I applaud her for her courage and common sense in an era when truth is sacrificed on the altar of political correctness. It takes real guts to stand up against a hoax that has inflicted immeasurable damage on Canada. And let's call it what it is. It's a hoax. The so-called mass graves of Indigenous children at the Kamloops Indian Residential School were never found because they never existed. When Conservative BC MLA Dallas Brody called this out for the lie that it is, the action was swift and predictable. BC Indigenous Relations Minister Christine Boyle accusing her of residential school denialism. Stuart Phillip, Grand Chief of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, went even further, calling her words a smokescreen for anti-Indigenous racism. And yet, the only thing that actually matters, whether or not there are mass graves, on that, Brody was right. Just as James Heller was right when he sued the Law Society of BC for defamation over their insistence on calling these non-existent burials confirmed, when no such confirmation exists. No such confirmation exists. Yesterday, I was joined on the program by Jim McMurtry, a man who was fired from his teaching job in Abbotsford, British Columbia, simply for telling the truth to his students, the truth that Indigenous students in residential schools died from things like tuberculosis and smallpox. That's a fact. It's undeniable. They didn't die because they were strangled in their sleep by Catholic priests and buried in unmarked graves under the cover of night. That's the narrative that's being peddled. So for stating this historical fact, Jim McMurtry was fired. That tells you everything you need to know about the state of free speech in this country. And Jim McMurtry came on my show yesterday to present new, documented proof of what many of us suspected from the beginning. There are no remains of 215 Indigenous children buried at the former Kamloops Residential School. The much-lauded ground-penetrating radar detected nothing more than a septic field lined with clay tiles installed a century ago. He has the blueprints. Not a single missing or unaccounted for Indigenous child. Not a single exhumed grave. Not one shred of physical evidence to support the hysterical accusations that priests and nuns secretly slaughtered children and dumped them into mass burial sites. And yet, despite this complete lack of evidence, in fact, evidence to the contrary, millions and millions of taxpayer dollars were funneled into various Indigenous bands under the pretext of excavating and investigating these supposed unmarked graves. So what did they do with the money? In Kamloops, at least, it wasn't used for digging up or exhuming graves. It was used to build a healing center. A healing center for the trauma of murdered Indigenous children who were never actually murdered? This hoax branded Canada as a genocidal nation. It led to the cancellation of our founding father, Sir John A. Macdonald. It provided the justification for a wave of anti-Christian terrorism with over 100 churches across Canada, many of them Indigenous, burned, vandalized, or desecrated. And all of it, every single bit was based on nothing more than a fraudulent narrative pushed by radical activists, the Liberal government, and a complicit media that was all too eager to paint Canada as an evil colonialist, white supremacist hellhole. Even the federal government is starting to quietly distance itself from this lie. Just this month, Parks Canada officially designated the Kamloops Indian Residential School as a National Historic Site, but conspicuously omitted any reference to the alleged 215 missing children. Now, why would they do that? because they know. They know the truth. They know that when this hoax fully unravels, it'll be an indictment of the entire liberal establishment and the vast multi-billion-dollar indigenous grievance industry that it has cultivated. And yet, Trudeau, who eagerly rushed to Kamloops in 2021 to pay his respects to the imaginary graves, has never retracted his statement. He's never apologized for the destruction and division that this falsehood has caused. His government allocated at least $12.1 million to investigate these so-called unmarked graves. And where did that money go? To publicists, to consultants, to activists. Not to exhuming bodies, because there were no bodies to exhume. Let's talk about the real reason the government won't fully abandon this narrative. The mass graves hoax is the cornerstone of a much larger agenda. The permanent vilification of Canada's history, the erasure of its European heritage, and the redistribution of billions of taxpayer dollars to an indigenous industry that thrives on perpetual victimhood. And let's be clear, this indigenous industry is not run by the average First Nations person. No, it's controlled by elite indigenous activists, lawyers, consultants, overwhelmingly white liberal bureaucrats who've made a career out of manufacturing and perpetuating indigenous grievances. They're the ones who profit from these falsehoods. They're the ones who rake in millions in government grants and payouts, while ordinary indigenous people continue to struggle with high rates of addiction and crime and poverty, lack of proper drinking water. What happened at Kamloops is a microcosm of what's happened across the country. Similar unsubstantiated claims of mass graves have been made at residential school sites in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and just like in Kamloops, not a single body has been exhumed. Not one. But that doesn't matter to the activists. The narrative is all that matters. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission called residential schools a cultural genocide. Now we hear from activists and the media that it was a literal genocide. What happened to cultural? That word disappeared when it no longer served the political agenda. And what do we do in Canada to supposed perpetrators of genocide? We tear down their statues. We erase their names from schools and roads. We vilify their memory. That's what happened to Sir John A. Macdonald. That's what's happening to anyone who dares to challenge this falsehood. That's what they tried to do to Jim McMurtry, to James Heller, and now to Dallas Brody. Well, I say enough is enough. Enough of this fraud. Enough of this mass delusion. Enough of this endless, self-flagellating national guilt trip that has been inflicted upon us by the liberal establishment and their activist allies. The truth is out. The mass graves hoax has been exposed. And no matter how much the activists scream denialism, no matter how much the media covers for them, no matter how much the government tries to quietly walk back its claims without admitting fault, the facts remain the same. There were no mass graves. There was no genocide. This country deserves better than to be led by cowards who refuse to stand up for the truth. We need more people like Dallas Brody, more people like Jim McMurtry, more people like James Heller. We need leaders who are willing to call out lies when they see them, no matter how unpopular it may be. It's time to stop apologizing for a crime that was never committed. It's time to reject the slander that has been used to smear this country, its history, its people. Canada is not a genocidal nation, and we will not be bullied into pretending otherwise. Hey, this is Richard Syrett. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe.